The thunder crashed so violently that Zachary Anders thought the roof of his modest ranch house might split apart. And when the frantic knocking came moments later, he assumed it was just a loose shutter being thrown against the wood by the vicious Montana wind. But the knocking came again, desperate and human, and when he pulled open the door against the gale that October night in 1878, he found a woman collapsed against the frame, drenched to the bone, and shivering so hard her teeth rattled together like dice in a cup. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and her traveling dress was torn at the hem, caked with mud up to her knees. She looked up at him with eyes that held equal parts fear and exhaustion. And in that single moment, though Zachary could not have known it then, everything about his carefully ordered, solitary life began to unravel and reassemble into something entirely different. "Please," she managed through chattering teeth, and that single word carried such weight that Zachary stepped aside without another thought, ushering her into the warm glow of his fireplace. Water pooled beneath her feet on the wooden floor as she stood there, swaying slightly, and Zachary realized she was likely moments from collapsing entirely. He grabbed the heavy quilt from the back of his armchair and wrapped it around her shoulders, guiding her toward the fire. "Sit," he said, his voice gruff from disuse. He lived alone out here, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, and days could pass without him speaking to another soul. "I will get you some dry clothes and something warm to drink." She nodded but said nothing, her eyes fixed on the flames as if they were the most precious thing she had ever seen. Zachary moved quickly to his bedroom, pulling out an old flannel shirt and a pair of work pants that would be far too large for her, but at least would be dry. He grabbed thick wool socks as well and brought everything back to the main room. "There is a privacy screen in the corner," he said, pointing to the far side of the room where he kept a simple folding screen he had purchased years ago but rarely used. "Change into these and I will make coffee." She took the clothes with trembling hands and managed a weak "thank you" before shuffling behind the screen. As Zachary put the coffee pot on the stove, he found his mind racing with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? The nearest town, Utica, Montana, was a good 8 miles south, and in this storm on foot, that journey would have been treacherous if not impossible. Yet here she was, appearing at his door like some kind of apparition summoned by the lightning itself. He heard the wet fabric hitting the floor behind the screen and forced himself to focus on the coffee, on the simple mechanical task of measuring grounds and water. He was not used to having anyone in his home, much less a woman, and certainly not one in such a vulnerable state. At 29 years old, Zachary had grown comfortable with his solitude, had built a life around it after the war had taken so much from him. The ranch was small but profitable enough, his cattle healthy, his days predictable and quiet. This unexpected intrusion felt both alarming and strangely exhilarating. She emerged from behind the screen looking almost childlike in his oversized clothing, the sleeves of the flannel shirt rolled up several times and the pants cinched tight with a piece of rope she must have found. Her hair was still wet, but no longer dripping, and she had attempted to comb it back from her face with her fingers. Now that she was no longer quite so bedraggled, Zachary could see that she was young, probably in her early 20s, with delicate features and intelligent eyes that were an unusual shade of amber, like honey held up to sunlight. "Sit by the fire," he said again, softer this time, and she obeyed, settling into the armchair with the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one, which she accepted with both hands, holding it close to her face to breathe in the steam. For several long minutes, they sat in silence broken only by the howling wind outside and the crackle of the fire. Zachary pulled up a wooden chair and sat across from her, giving her space and time to collect herself. He was not a man who rushed things, and he sensed that whatever had brought her here was not a simple story. Finally, she took a sip of the coffee and spoke. "My name is Beatrice Ramsey," she said, and her voice was stronger now, with a hint of an accent he could not quite place. "I am sorry for appearing at your door like this. I had nowhere else to go." "Zachary Anders," he replied with a small nod. "You are welcome here. The storm is too fierce for anyone to be out in, let alone a woman alone. Where were you headed?" Beatrice looked down into her coffee cup and he saw her jaw tighten. "Away," she said simply. "Just away." He waited, and when she did not elaborate, he asked, "From Utica?" She shook her head. "From a ranch about 15 miles north of here. I was working as a housekeeper for a family there, the Coopers. Do you know them?" Zachary searched his memory and came up with a vague recollection of an older couple with grown sons who ran a large cattle operation in that direction. He had met them once or twice at the market in town but knew little about them. "I know of them," he said carefully. Beatrice's expression darkened. "The eldest son, Thomas, he—" She paused, and Zachary saw her hands tighten around the cup. "He would not leave me alone. For weeks he made advances, said inappropriate things. I ignored him, tried to stay out of his way, but tonight he came to my room. He was drunk and he tried to." Her voice cracked and she took a shaky breath. "I fought him off and ran. I took nothing but the clothes on my back. I just ran into the storm, and I kept running until I saw your light." A cold anger settled in Zachary's chest, the kind that was quiet but absolute. He had seen enough cruelty in his life, during the war and after, and the thought of a man forcing himself on a woman under his family's own roof made his blood run cold. "You did the right thing," he said firmly. "You are safe here. He will not find you, and even if he did, he would have to go through me." Beatrice looked up at him, and for the first time since she had arrived, something like hope flickered in her eyes. "You do not even know me," she said softly. "Why would you help me?" "Because it is the right thing to do," Zachary replied simply. "And because no one deserves to be treated the way you were." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he felt something shift in the air between them, a connection forming that was as unexpected as the storm itself. Then she looked away, back to the fire, and took another sip of her coffee. "You can stay here as long as you need," Zachary continued. "I have a small spare room. It is not much, but it is warm and dry, and the door has a lock." "I cannot impose on you like that," Beatrice protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "You are not imposing. I am offering." He stood and moved toward the narrow hallway that led to the back of the house. "Come, I will show you." The spare room was indeed small, barely large enough for the single bed and small dresser it contained, but it was clean, and the window had a thick curtain that blocked out the wind. Zachary lit the oil lamp on the dresser and turned to face her. "Take all the time you need. We can talk more in the morning when the storm has passed." Beatrice stood in the doorway, the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you, Zachary. I will find a way to repay your kindness." "No repayment needed," he said, moving past her back into the hallway. "Get some rest." He closed her door gently and returned to the main room, standing by the fire and listening to the storm rage outside. His quiet life had just become decidedly more complicated, but as he settled into his own bed an hour later, Zachary found that he did not mind nearly as much as he thought he would. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world outside scrubbed clean and glistening with moisture. Zachary woke before dawn, as he always did, and moved quietly through his morning routine, not wanting to disturb his unexpected guest. He fed the chickens, milked the cow, and checked on the horses in the small barn, finding them restless but unharmed from the night's weather. When he returned to the house, he found Beatrice already awake, standing by the stove with a look of determination on her face. "I hope you do not mind," she said, gesturing to the pan where eggs were sizzling alongside thick slices of bacon. "I wanted to make myself useful." "I do not mind at all," Zachary replied, surprised and pleased. "That smells wonderful." They ate breakfast together at his small wooden table, and in the morning light, Zachary found himself stealing glances at her when he thought she was not looking. She had an understated beauty, the kind that grew more pronounced the longer you looked at it. Her movements were efficient and graceful, and there was an intelligence in her eyes that suggested a quick mind and a strong will. "Tell me about yourself," Beatrice said as she poured them both more coffee. "How does a man end up living alone out here?" Zachary considered the question, debating how much to share. He was not accustomed to talking about himself, but something about her open expression made him want to try. "I came to Montana after the war," he began. "I was 21 and had nothing left back in Ohio. My parents died while I was away fighting, and my younger brother was killed at Gettysburg. There was nothing to go back to, so I headed west looking for a fresh start." "That must have been incredibly difficult," Beatrice said softly, and there was genuine sympathy in her voice. "It was, but it was also necessary. I bought this land with my saved wages and built this house with my own hands. The work gave me purpose when I had none, and the solitude helped me heal." He paused, then added, "Or at least I thought it did." "What do you mean?" He met her eyes directly. "I realize now I may have been hiding instead of healing. There is a difference." Beatrice nodded slowly. "I understand that. I have been hiding too in my own way. Taking positions in remote places, keeping to myself, never staying anywhere too long. I told myself it was because I liked the freedom, but really I was just afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of being seen. Of being known. Of letting anyone get close enough to hurt me." She laughed quietly, without humor. "And yet people still find ways to hurt you, even when you try to keep them at a distance." They fell into a comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Outside, a crow called from somewhere in the trees, and the morning sun streamed through the windows, turning the dust motes into tiny flecks of gold. "What will you do now?" Zachary asked eventually. "Do you have family somewhere? Friends who could take you in?" Beatrice shook her head. "My parents died when I was 17. I have an aunt back east, but we were never close. I have been on my own for 6 years now, moving from job to job. I suppose I will do the same now. Once the roads are dry enough to travel, I will head to Utica and look for work there." "Or," Zachary said, the words coming out before he had fully thought them through, "you could stay here. I could use help around the ranch, and you would have a safe place to live, away from the Coopers and anyone else who might trouble you." Beatrice looked at him with surprise. "You are offering me a job?" "Yes. I can pay you fair wages, and you would have the spare room for yourself. The work is not easy, but I think you are not afraid of hard work." "I am not," she agreed. "But are you certain? You do not know anything about me beyond what I told you last night." "I could be lying. I could be trouble." "Are you lying?" "No. Then there is no trouble." He stood and began clearing the breakfast dishes. "Think about it. You do not have to decide today." But even as he said it, Zachary felt a strange certainty settling in his chest. He wanted her to stay. Not just because she needed help, or because he needed an extra hand with the ranch, but because in the few short hours since she had arrived, his house had felt more like a home than it had in 8 years of solitary living. There was a rightness to her presence that he could not explain and did not want to question. Beatrice helped him wash and dry the dishes, and when they were done, she turned to him and said, "I accept your offer. I will stay and work for you, at least for a while." And if it does not work out, I can always move on." "Fair enough," Zachary said, though he found himself hoping very much that it would work out. The days that followed fell into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. Beatrice proved to be a quick learner and a tireless worker, taking on the household chores with efficiency while also helping Zachary with the animals and the land. She could cook better than he ever could, turning simple ingredients into meals that actually had flavor and variety. She mended his clothes, organized his chaotic pantry, and even helped him repair a section of fence that had been damaged in the storm. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. Zachary learned that Beatrice had grown up in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. She had been educated beyond what was common for women of her class, and she loved books with a passion that made her eyes light up when she spoke about them. He shared his own small collection with her, mostly practical volumes about ranching and animal husbandry, but also a few novels he had acquired over the years and never quite gotten around to reading. "These are wonderful," Beatrice exclaimed one evening, running her fingers over the worn spines. "I have not had access to books in so long. Most of the families I worked for had no interest in reading." "Take whatever you like," Zachary said. "I am afraid I am not much of a reader myself, but my mother was. She insisted I learn to appreciate literature, though I fear I was always more interested in practical matters." "There is nothing wrong with being practical," Beatrice said, selecting a slim volume of poetry and settling into the armchair. "The world needs practical people. But it needs dreamers too." "And which are you?" she thought about it. "Both, I think. I dream of a better life, but I am practical enough to work toward it rather than just wishing for it." As the weeks passed and October gave way to November, Zachary found himself increasingly aware of Beatrice in ways that had nothing to do with her capabilities as a ranch hand. He noticed the way she hummed while she worked, usually old hymns or folk songs he half remembered from his childhood. He noticed the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, and the way her whole face transformed when she laughed, which was becoming more and more frequent. He noticed the graceful strength in her hands and the determined set of her jaw when she tackled a difficult task. And he noticed the way his heart seemed to beat a little faster when she entered a room, the way his days felt brighter and more purposeful with her in them. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, this growing attachment, and Zachary did not know quite what to do about it. For her part, Beatrice was experiencing her own confusing tangle of emotions. She had come to Zachary's door desperate and afraid, expecting at best a night's shelter, before being sent on her way. Instead, she had found safety and kindness, and something that felt dangerously close to belonging. Zachary was unlike any man she had ever known. He was quiet but not cold, strong but not domineering, capable of great gentleness despite his rugged exterior. She admired the way he treated his animals with care and respect, the way he worked from sunup to sundown without complaint, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words actually mattered. And she was drawn to him in ways that frightened her, having promised herself long ago that she would never let a man get close enough to have power over her heart. Yet here she was, finding excuses to be near him, lingering over evening conversations, lying awake at night thinking about the sound of his voice and the rare, wonderful warmth of his smile. One particularly cold morning in mid-November, Zachary was working in the barn when one of his horses, a temperamental mare named Sally, spooked at a mouse and reared back, catching him in the shoulder with her hoof. The impact sent him sprawling into the hay, and for a moment he could not catch his breath, pain radiating down his arm in sharp waves. Beatrice, who had been feeding the chickens nearby, heard the commotion and came running. She found Zachary sitting up but pale, his left arm cradled against his chest. "What happened?" she asked urgently, dropping to her knees beside him. "Sally got frightened," he managed, trying to downplay it even though his shoulder felt like it was on fire. "I am fine." "You are not fine, you are hurt. Let me see." Her hands were gentle but firm as she helped him remove his coat and shirt, revealing a shoulder that was already beginning to bruise. She probed carefully, and though he tried not to, Zachary winced. "I do not think anything is broken," she said, "but it is a bad bruise. You need to rest it." "I have work to do," he protested. "And I can do it," she countered. "You have been taking care of me for weeks now. Let me take care of you for a change." There was something in her eyes, a tenderness mixed with determination, that made it impossible to argue. Zachary allowed her to help him back to the house, where she settled him in the armchair and made a cold compress for his shoulder. For the rest of the day, she took over all his tasks, checking on the cattle, splitting wood for the fire, and even handling Sally, who seemed properly chastened by the incident. Watching her work through the window, Zachary felt a surge of emotion so strong it almost overwhelmed him. This was more than attraction, more than gratitude. This was something deeper and more profound, something he had never expected to feel again after losing so much in the war. He was falling in love with Beatrice Ramsey, if he had not already fallen completely. That evening, as she helped him eat dinner since his shoulder was too sore to manage it properly, Beatrice said quietly, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" Zachary asked, concerned by her serious tone. "I think I need to leave soon. Not because I want to, but because I am becoming too comfortable here, too attached." She looked down at her hands. This was supposed to be temporary, a place to recover and earn some money before moving on. "But the longer I stay, the harder it will be to go, and I do not want to overstay my welcome or become a burden." "You could never be a burden," Zachary said firmly, reaching out with his good arm to take her hand. "And you are not overstaying anything. I want you here, Beatrice. I want you to stay, not as an employee, but as—" He paused, gathering his courage. "As someone I care about very deeply." She looked up at him, her amber eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. "You do?" "I do. I have been trying to figure out how to tell you for weeks now. I know this is unexpected and probably improper, and if you do not feel the same way, I understand. But I could not let you talk about leaving without telling you the truth. These past weeks with you have been the happiest I have known in years. You have brought life and light into this house and into my heart, and the thought of you leaving makes me realize just how much I have come to care for you." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "I tried so hard not to, tried to keep my distance, but you make it impossible. You are kind and good and steady, and when I am with you, I feel safe in a way I have never felt before. I feel like I can be myself, fully and completely, without fear or pretense." Zachary stood, ignoring the protest from his injured shoulder, and pulled her up to face him. "Then stay," he said. "Not as my employee, but as my partner, as someone who belongs here just as much as I do. Stay and let us see where this takes us." "Yes," Beatrice said. And then she was in his arms, careful of his injury, and he was holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other, and Zachary felt something settle deep in his soul. A sense of rightness and completion he had been searching for without even knowing it. When they finally pulled apart, Beatrice reached up and touched his face gently. "I never thought I would find this," she said softly. "I never thought I would find someone who sees me and accepts me exactly as I am." "I could say the same," Zachary replied, covering her hand with his own. "You walked into my life during a storm and you changed everything. You made me realize I was not living, just existing. You gave me something to hope for again." She kissed him then, a gentle press of lips that sent warmth flooding through his entire body despite the cold November evening. It was sweet and tentative and full of promise, and when they broke apart, they were both smiling. The winter that followed was the coldest Montana had seen in years, but inside the ranch house, Zachary and Beatrice were warm. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, growing from tentative affection into something solid and enduring. They worked side by side during the short daylight hours, caring for the animals and maintaining the property. And in the long evenings, they sat by the fire and talked about everything and nothing. Zachary told her about the war, about the things he had seen and done that still haunted him sometimes in the night. Beatrice told him about her childhood, about losing her parents to fever within days of each other, about the loneliness and fear of those first years on her own. They shared their dreams and fears, their hopes for the future, their small joys and private sorrows. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the small intimacies that come from sharing a life. By the time spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the world green again, they both knew that this was not a passing fancy or a convenience born of circumstance. This was real and true and meant to last. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, Zachary turned to Beatrice and said, "Marry me." It was not a question so much as a statement, a simple declaration of intent, but Beatrice treated it with the gravity it deserved. "Yes," she said, taking his hand. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed a month later in Utica, in a small church with white walls and simple wooden pews. There were few guests, just a handful of neighbors and townspeople who had come to know them both over the winter months when they made their weekly trips to town for supplies. Beatrice wore a simple dress of pale blue that she had sewn herself, and Zachary wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary kissed Beatrice with such tenderness that several of the older women in attendance dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the general store, with cake and lemonade and well wishes from people who genuinely seemed happy for them. As they rode back to the ranch in the wagon, Beatrice rested her head on Zachary's shoulder and said, "I cannot believe this is my life now. 6 months ago I was running through a storm with nothing. Now I have everything." "We have everything," Zachary corrected gently. "We built this together." She smiled up at him. "You are right. We did." Life as a married couple brought new rhythms and new joys. Beatrice took charge of expanding the vegetable garden, planting not just practical crops but flowers as well, bright splashes of color that made the house look welcoming and loved. Zachary built her a small chicken coop closer to the house so she would not have to walk as far in the mornings, and together they painted it a cheerful red that could be seen from the road. They acquired 2 more cows and a bull, with plans to slowly expand the herd. They repaired the roof and added a small addition to the house, a proper bedroom that was larger and more comfortable than either of the original small rooms. They talked about the future, about how many children they wanted and what they would name them, about growing old together on this land they both loved. But life, as it often does, had challenges in store. That summer brought a drought, the worst the area had seen in a decade. The creek that ran through their property slowed to a trickle and then dried up entirely, forcing Zachary to haul water from the well for the animals, a back-breaking task that consumed hours each day. The garden struggled, and several of the chickens died in the heat. Zachary worked himself to exhaustion trying to keep everything alive, and Beatrice worried about him constantly. One particularly brutal afternoon, she found him collapsed by the well, overcome by heat and dehydration. She managed to get him into the house and cooled him down with wet cloths, forcing him to drink water even though he protested that the animals needed it more. "The animals will not survive if you kill yourself trying to save them," she said firmly. "You are no good to them or to me dead." It was harsh but necessary, and Zachary knew she was right. From that day forward, they worked together more strategically, prioritizing the strongest animals and accepting that they might lose some of the weaker ones. It was a hard decision, but it was the practical choice, and it allowed them to preserve the core of their herd. By the time the drought broke in late August, bringing blessed rain that fell for 3 days straight, they had lost 4 chickens and 1 cow, but the rest had survived. They stood on the porch together and watched the rain fall, holding hands and feeling grateful for what they still had. "We made it through," Beatrice said softly. "We did," Zachary agreed. "Together." That word "together" had become the cornerstone of their marriage. They faced everything as a team, supporting each other through difficulties and celebrating victories side by side. When Beatrice discovered she was pregnant in the fall, Zachary was overjoyed but also terrified. He had lost so many people he loved, and the thought of losing either Beatrice or the baby was almost more than he could bear. But Beatrice was strong and healthy, and the pregnancy progressed smoothly. She continued to work around the ranch well into her 7th month, though Zachary did his best to take on the heavier tasks. He hovered over her constantly, much to her amused exasperation, checking that she was not overexerting herself and insisting she rest more than she felt was necessary. "I am not made of glass," she told him one afternoon when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." "I know," Zachary said, "but you are my wife and that is my child, and I would rather be overcautious than risk losing either of you." Beatrice softened at that, setting down the basket and taking his face in her hands. "You are not going to lose us," she said gently. "I promise. I am healthy and strong, and this baby is going to be just fine. Trust me." He did trust her, but the fear lingered anyway, a shadow at the edge of his happiness. It stayed with him through the winter months as Beatrice grew larger and the baby's arrival drew near. He made preparations with almost obsessive care, securing the services of a midwife in Utica, stocking up on supplies, making sure the house was as warm and comfortable as possible. When Beatrice went into labor on a cold February night in 1880, Zachary rode through the darkness to fetch the midwife, pushing his horse harder than he probably should have. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered half the babies in the county, arrived with her bag of supplies and took charge immediately. She sent Zachary out of the room, telling him he would just be in the way, and he spent the longest night of his life pacing the main room and listening to Beatrice's cries from behind the closed door. Just before dawn, he heard a different cry, high and strong, and then Mrs. Patterson opened the door with a smile on her face. "You have a son," she announced. "A big, healthy boy, and your wife did beautifully. She is tired but well." Zachary felt his knees go weak with relief. "I can see them, of course. Come meet your son." He entered the bedroom to find Beatrice propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a bundle wrapped in soft blankets. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "Look what we made," she said softly. Zachary approached the bed and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a round, red face and a surprising amount of dark hair, and his tiny fists were clenched tight, as if ready to fight the world. Zachary felt a surge of love so intense it was almost painful, a fierce protective instinct that he knew would shape the rest of his life. "He is perfect," Zachary whispered, reaching out to touch one tiny hand. The baby's fingers uncurled and wrapped around his father's finger with surprising strength. "He is absolutely perfect. We are calling him Zachary after you," Beatrice said. "Are you certain? I thought you liked the name Joseph." "I did, but looking at him, I see you. I see your strength and your goodness, and I want him to carry your name." She smiled tiredly. "Besides, Joseph can be the second one." "The second one?" Zachary raised an eyebrow. "You are already planning the next baby, not planning exactly." "But I am not opposed to the idea, once I recover from this one." She laughed softly. "But let us get through the first few months before we think about that." Young Zachary, whom they immediately began calling by the nickname Zeke to avoid confusion, proved to be a healthy and relatively easy baby. He nursed well, slept in reasonable stretches, and had a generally sunny disposition. Watching Beatrice with their son, seeing the tender way she cared for him and the fierce love in her eyes when she looked at him, Zachary fell in love with his wife all over again. The months passed quickly, as they always do with a new baby. Zeke grew and changed with astonishing speed, going from a tiny, helpless infant to a chubby, smiling baby who could sit up and grab at everything within reach. Zachary and Beatrice adapted to parenthood with the same teamwork they brought to everything else, taking turns with night feedings and diaper changes, sharing the workload so neither was overwhelmed. As Zeke approached his first birthday, Beatrice confirmed what she had suspected for a few weeks. She was pregnant again. This time, the news brought joy without the fear that had accompanied the first pregnancy. They knew what to expect, knew that Beatrice was strong and capable, knew that they could handle whatever came. Their second child, a girl they named Rose after Beatrice's mother, arrived in the spring of 1881 with much less drama than her brother. The labor was shorter, the delivery easier, and Beatrice recovered quickly. Rose was smaller and quieter than Zeke had been, with her mother's amber eyes and a tendency to watch everything with serious concentration. With two young children, the ranch became both more chaotic and more joyful. Zachary built a larger chicken coop and expanded the garden to help feed their growing family. Beatrice somehow managed to care for two babies while still helping with the ranch work, though Zachary insisted on hiring a young man from town to help with the heavier labor during the summer months. They settled into a life that was full and busy and good, filled with the small daily pleasures of watching their children grow and working the land they loved. Zachary often thought back to that stormy October night when Beatrice had knocked on his door, and he marveled at how completely his life had changed. He had gone from a lonely man hiding from the world to a husband and father, surrounded by love and purpose. One evening when Zeke was 3 and Rose was 2, after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Zachary and Beatrice sat on the porch together watching the stars. It had become their ritual, this quiet time at the end of the day when they could reconnect and simply be together. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if that storm had not come?" Beatrice asked, leaning against his shoulder. "If I had not ended up at your door that night?" "Sometimes," Zachary admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. The thought of never having met you, never having this life we have built together, it is too painful to consider. I think about it too. I wonder where I would be now, what my life would look like. Certainly nothing like this." She gestured to the house behind them, warm and full of the evidence of their life together. "I would probably still be moving from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, never trusting anyone enough to let them close." "You trusted me," Zachary said. Even when you had no reason to, you came to my door and took a chance on a stranger. I did not have much choice. It was trust you or freeze to death in the storm." She smiled. "But I am glad I did. You gave me everything I never knew I needed. A home, a family, a place to belong. You gave me love. You gave me the same," Zachary said, pulling her closer. "You saved me, Beatrice. You saved me from a half-life of going through the motions. You reminded me what it feels like to truly live." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the occasional lowing of cattle and the chirp of crickets. Inside, one of the children stirred and made a small sound before settling back into sleep. "I want more," Beatrice said suddenly. "More what?" "More of this. More children, more years together, more of everything." She turned to look at him. "I want to grow old with you on this ranch. I want to see our children grow up and have children of their own. I want to build a life that is so full and rich and complete that when we finally leave this world, we do so knowing we lived every moment to its fullest." Zachary kissed her forehead. "Then that is what we will do. We will build that life together, one day at a time." And they did. Over the next several years, their family continued to grow. A third child came, another boy they named Joseph as Beatrice had wanted, and then a fourth, a girl named Clara. The ranch grew too, expanding gradually as Zachary purchased adjacent land from a neighbor who was retiring and moving back east. They built a larger barn and a proper bunkhouse for the ranch hands they now employed during the busy seasons. The children grew strong and healthy, helping with age-appropriate chores and learning the rhythms of ranch life. Zeke showed an early aptitude for working with animals, spending hours in the barn with his father learning about cattle and horses. Rose had her mother's love of books and her father's practical nature, always asking questions and wanting to understand how things worked. Joseph was adventurous and fearless, constantly getting into scrapes and keeping his parents on their toes. Clara, the baby, was sweet and affectionate, quick to laugh and slow to anger. There were challenges, of course. Years when the weather was bad and the crops failed, times when illness swept through the ranch and they lost animals or feared for their children's health. There were moments of frustration and exhaustion, times when the work seemed endless and the obstacles insurmountable. But through it all, Zachary and Beatrice faced everything together, their love providing a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. As the years passed, and the 19th century drew to a close, they found themselves in their 40s with a ranch that had become one of the most successful in the area. Their children were growing into capable young people with bright futures ahead of them. Zeke, now nearly 18, was already being courted by several families with eligible daughters, much to his embarrassment. Rose, at 17, had announced her intention to become a teacher, inspired by stories of her maternal grandmother. Joseph and Clara were still young but showing promise in their own ways. One spring afternoon in 1896, Zachary and Beatrice stood on the porch of their expanded house and looked out over their land. The fields were green with new growth, the cattle were fat and healthy, and in the distance, they could hear their children's laughter as they played near the creek that had given them so much trouble during that first drought years ago. "We did well, did we not?" Beatrice said, taking Zachary's hand. "We did very well," he agreed. "Better than I ever imagined possible. Do you remember what you told me that first morning after the storm? You said you thought you had been hiding instead of healing. I remember. Do you still feel that way?" Zachary thought about it, considering the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "I think I needed that time alone to process what I had lost in the war, but you were right to call it hiding because I had gotten stuck there. I had forgotten how to move forward." Then you came, and you reminded me that life is not meant to be lived alone. You showed me that healing does not mean forgetting the past, it means building a future despite it. Beatrice leaned her head against his shoulder. You saved me too, you know. I was running when I came to your door, running from more than just that awful man. I was running from the possibility of connection, of trust, of love. I had convinced myself that being alone was safer than risking being hurt. But you proved me wrong. You showed me that love is worth the risk. They stood there together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Inside the house, they could hear the older children starting to prepare dinner, a responsibility they had taken on as they got older. From the barn came the sound of one of the ranch hands singing as he finished the evening chores. Everything was peaceful and good and right. I love you, Zachary said quietly. I have loved you from that first night when you appeared at my door like some kind of miracle. And I will love you until my last breath and beyond. I love you too, Beatrice replied. You are my home, Zachary Anders. You always have been, from the moment you opened that door and let me in out of the storm. As the years continued to pass, their love only deepened. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their 4 children and a growing collection of grandchildren. As Zeke had married a kind young woman named Sarah and given them 2 beautiful grandsons. They watched Rose become an excellent teacher in Utica, educating the next generation with the same passion for learning her grandmother had possessed. Joseph eventually took over the day-to-day operations of the ranch, showing a natural talent for management and animal husbandry. And Clara married a young doctor and moved to a neighboring town, though she visited often with her own growing family. Zachary and Beatrice grew old together on the land they loved, their hair turning gray and then white, their movements slower but their minds still sharp. They spent their days working in the garden, playing with grandchildren, and sitting on the porch watching the world go by. They had built a legacy that would last long after they were gone, not just in the successful ranch but in the children and grandchildren they had raised with love and care. On a warm summer evening in 1915, when Zachary was 66 and Beatrice was 60, they sat on that same porch where they had spent so many evenings over the years. Zachary's health had been declining for the past year, his heart growing weaker, and they both knew that their time together was drawing to a close. I wish we could have more time, Beatrice said softly, holding his hand. Another 37 years is not enough. It would never be enough, Zachary agreed. I could have 1,000 years with you and still want more, but we have had a good life, Bea, a full life. We have loved and been loved. We have built something that will endure long after we are gone. Not many people can say that. No, they cannot. She wiped away tears. But it still hurts to know we are running out of time. Then let us not waste the time we have left on sadness. Let us fill it with joy and gratitude for everything we have shared. And they did. They spent Zachary's remaining weeks surrounded by family, telling stories of the early days on the ranch, laughing at old memories, and making sure everyone knew how much they were loved. When Zachary finally passed peacefully in his sleep on a September night with Beatrice holding his hand, the grief was profound but not bitter. He had lived a full life and died knowing he was loved, and that was more than most could hope for. Beatrice lived another 8 years without him, long enough to see more grandchildren born and to watch Rose become the principal of the school where she taught. She spent those years maintaining the ranch with Joseph's help, working in her garden, and writing down the story of her life with Zachary so that future generations would know how it all began. She wrote about the storm, about knocking on a stranger's door, about the man who opened it and changed everything. She wrote about building a life from nothing, about love that endured through hardship and joy alike, about the simple miracle of two lonely people finding each other at exactly the right moment. When Beatrice finally joined Zachary in the town cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, her children gathered around her grave and read from the story she had written. They cried, but they also smiled, because the story was not a sad one. It was a story of hope and love and second chances, of storms that bring unexpected blessings, of doors that open onto entirely new lives. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family along with the story of how it all began. Great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren grew up hearing about the woman who knocked during a storm and the man who opened the door, about how a single moment of kindness and courage had created an entire legacy. The old house was eventually replaced with a newer, larger one, but they kept the original door, the one that Beatrice had knocked on that October night in 1878, mounted in a place of honor in the front hall as a reminder that sometimes the most important moments in our lives come when we least expect them. And so the love story of Zachary Anders and Beatrice Ramsey lived on, not just in the memories of those who knew them, but in the very land they had worked and loved, in the family they had created, in the legacy of compassion and courage they left behind. It was a reminder that love can be found in the most unlikely circumstances, that opening your door and your heart to someone in need can change not just their life but yours as well, and that the best love stories are not the ones that happen easily, but the ones that are built day by day through choice and commitment and unwavering devotion. Their graves sat side by side on that hill, the headstones simple but elegant, marked with their names and the dates of their lives and a single inscription that said everything that needed to be said. Together always, from the storm to eternity. And on summer evenings when the wind blew just right, you could almost hear the echo of their laughter, the murmur of their voices in quiet conversation, the sound of two souls who had found each other in the darkness and created a light that would never go out. The town of Utica, Montana, grew and changed over the decades, but the Anders Ranch remained a constant, a testament to what could be built when two people chose to build it together. Visitors sometimes stopped by, drawn by the story they had heard, and the family who lived there still, descendants of that original union, welcomed them warmly and told the tale again. They showed them the old door, still solid after more than a century, and they pointed out to the fields where Zachary had worked and the garden where Beatrice had planted her flowers, some varieties of which still bloomed every spring. It all started with a knock, they would say. Just a simple knock during a storm, and it became this. They would gesture to everything around them, the thriving ranch, the happy family, the legacy of love that had touched so many lives. It became everything, and that was the truth of it. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments. Sometimes a knock on a door during a storm is not just a request for shelter, but the beginning of something extraordinary. Sometimes the person you open that door for is not just someone in need, but the answer to a question you did not even know you were asking. Zachary had opened his door expecting nothing more than to help a stranger through a difficult night. He could never have imagined that the woman shivering on his threshold would become his wife, the mother of his children, his partner in building a life that would matter long after they were gone. He could never have known that her arrival would transform his careful solitude into a rich, full existence bursting with love and purpose and joy. And Beatrice, running through that storm with nothing but fear and desperation driving her forward, could never have imagined that the light she saw in the distance would lead her not just to shelter but to home. She could never have known that the quiet rancher who answered her desperate knock would see her, truly see her, and love her not despite her past, but because of everything that had shaped her into the woman she was. Their story was not perfect. They had faced hardships and losses, moments of doubt and difficulty. But through it all, they had chosen each other, again and again, building their love like Zachary had built his ranch, one careful choice at a time, with patience and dedication and an unwavering commitment to making it work. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the storm that brought them together or the challenges they faced along the way, but the choice to keep choosing each other, to keep building together, to keep loving each other through everything life threw at them. That was the real story, the one worth telling and retelling until the end of time. As the sun set over the Montana plains on yet another summer evening, casting long shadows across the land that Zachary and Beatrice had loved so well, their great-great-grandchildren played in the fields where their ancestors had once worked. They laughed and ran and lived their own lives, shaped but not bound by the legacy that had been left to them. And somewhere in the wind that whispered through the grass, somewhere in the warmth of the sun on the old house, somewhere in the very earth itself, the love of two people who had found each other in a storm continued to live on, as real and vital as it had been on that first night when everything changed with a simple knock on a door. That was the true magic of their story, the reason it endured across generations. It proved that love could triumph over loneliness, that kindness could transform lives, that two people who found each other at exactly the right moment could create something that would last forever. It proved that happy endings were not just for fairy tales, that ordinary people in ordinary circumstances could build extraordinary lives if they were brave enough to open the door when opportunity knocked. And so the story ended where all the best stories end, not with dramatic pronouncements or grand gestures, but with simple truth. They lived, they loved, they built a life together, and that life echoed through time, touching everyone who came after them with the reminder that love, real love, is worth every risk, every hardship, every moment of uncertainty. Because in the end, love is all that really matters, all that really lasts, all that makes the difficult journey of life worth taking. Zachary opened the door during a storm and his whole life changed. Beatrice knocked on that door with nowhere to go and found everything she had been searching for. Together, they created a legacy of love that would never fade, a story that would be told and retold, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them, arriving on our doorstep in the middle of a storm, asking only for shelter and offering in return the world.